And we are so thankful for your word and how it tells us truths that we could never think of on our own and we would never conceptualize in our own minds. But it is the truth, and it is what needs to be and must be. And holiness is one of those truths. And so, Lord, help us today learn holiness not only in its modeling and its practice in Leviticus, but in how that is all fleshed out, in its full drama, in your passion and zeal for purity, not only for Israel, but for the world. Help us to see the theology of it both on the vertical level relative to our relationship with you, as well as the horizontal level with your agenda for this world. And help us through that then to fear you and to love you and to treat you as you always should be treated, as holy. And may it make us thankful for our salvation, which makes the unholy holy. May we never lose that wonder and awe of what you have accomplished. So we ask for your strength at this time to be honored, and we ask that you would be glorified and you would be exalted high as we think through these things. Be with these students as the time of the semester is grueling. Help their eyes to focus on you. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so as we've been talking about, and this is going to be very important for the segue into our lecture on Numbers, we need to understand the context. And we know there is creation. We know the thesis of creation, that is the glory of God. Everything should be reflecting Him. That is in the concept of rest. Everything is set apart from Him. And in fact, this is going to be very important. The way God situates the Sabbath is important. I've emphasized rest and rest and rest and Noahic covenant and all that kind of stuff. Amen and amen. But there is an important aspect to this rest. There is an important concept and component to this rest. What did God do on the Sabbath? He blessed it and He what? Sanctified it. Another word for sanctified is actually to make something what? Holy. What we might have forgotten, and we shouldn't have, but we might have forgotten, is as God is accomplishing this whole agenda, raising up a seed to crush the serpent's head, a line that eventually becomes a nation that has designed to have an international impact, and we are talking about these things, and it has the Noahic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant which promises what? Land, seed, and what? Blessing. A blessing that goes back to Genesis chapter 1, and that blessing is mediated through a king. We've talked about that. We've even seen a little bit of that in Genesis 49:10, where there's this recreation taking place. When we've seen all of that happen, and that involves faith and God turning evil to what? Good. And we've seen even that launched in the Exodus with the whole notion of redemption, and how God is a saving God, and how He is a supreme God, and nothing can stop Him. And He's a good God because He forgives sins. And all of that is being revealed. What we might lose in all of this is the fact that the way it was, and the way it always has been, is that God is holy. In other words, you can't just turn evil to good by doing abracadabra. You can't just turn evil to good by just saying, hey, I'm going to make some good, and it's over. God's version of good is perfect. It's not like ours. God's version isn't just, hey, let's clean up a little bad stuff, and it's better. God's version of good is holy. That's what you have to understand. God's definition of good is holy. That's the way rest originally operated. That's the way blessing works. It goes back to how God blessed and sanctified. In fact, the very law itself in Exodus attests to God's holiness, and Israel's failure attests to God's holiness and man's depravity, and the fact that God has to forgive sins and will always punish sin and deal justice against sin shows that he is holy. And that's why Leviticus matters. Because you can't have all of these horizontal effects of evil to good, a world made right and a world made new, without holiness. Does that make sense to everybody? That's what the world actually wants, if you stop and think about it. I mean, if you go out and evangelize, or you talk to people and ask them, would you like a world where everything is right? Very few people are going to say, no, I think that world would be terrible. Or would you like a world where justice reigns and everything's made new and there's no degradation and there's no death? Very few people would say, oh, yeah, I think that would be a terrible place. I mean, by definition, if it's a perfect place, it's a perfect place. But what they don't want is holiness. That's the issue. They don't want how to get there. They don't want the real resolution of what it's going to demand and what it's going to require and necessitate for you to actually be holy, for you to actually have a world made right. They don't want that. That to them is totally foreign, but that is the issue. Genesis 1 says holiness is the issue. Into Genesis 2, because that's how rest works. Creation must be sanctified to God. That's how it is going to have true rest. Genesis 3, we have holiness violated, which carries over all the way to Exodus, which is why you have so much emphasis in Leviticus on what it emphasizes, namely holiness. Holiness. And everything has to be made right. Everything has to abide by holiness, the way you become holy. And the whole sacrificial system is meant to satisfy God's holiness. It is meant to model out what it means for God's holiness to be satisfied. And we see that God's holiness is in your preferences. Even if it's not a morally right or wrong issue, it's still about honoring God. Even whether you eat or drink, it must be for God's glory. Hence the food laws are the way they are. We can go through whether that be public and predominant circumstances in your life, like the birth of a child, to things that are very private and personal in nature. We can go to the Day of Atonement and demonstrate the nature of holiness. You guys should have all been familiar with this. And even in chapters 18 and 20, we understand that holiness shapes our worldview, because 18 and 20 deal with what we call sexual ethics. And it goes back to creation. You guys remember this. And adopting a real biblical worldview, a worldview that sees that, yes, this marriage is the only context. The marriage is what is supported by creation and instituted by God, and therefore sex outside of marriage can't exist. You can only have sexual immorality outside of marriage. Does it start to make sense to everybody? It's a very important worldview shift that we need to have. If you buy into the world's definitions of all these things, you're over before you even begin. We need to buy the Bible's conceptualizations, because that's the truth. That's holiness. And so we have that in Leviticus 18 through 20. We even saw that holiness is for leadership with the priests, and that's why they can't tear their garments, even though the high priest does when he criticizes Jesus. You guys remember me talking about that, yes? And then do you also remember that holiness pertains to Israel's time and how they do things together as a community? Do you remember me talking about this very, 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 very briefly? In fact, there are 3 feasts. Do you guys remember this? Where Israel must come together. 3 national feasts. One is Passover. Do you guys recall this? The other one is the Feast of Booths. And the other one is the Feast of Weeks. Not necessarily in that order. In fact, these two are switched around. Feast of Weeks, Feast of Passover, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Booths. And I just want to put a quick note on this, if you're in your notes, or just write this somewhere. What this shows is 2 things. One is that God is so holy, your time it must be holy. Your very cycle of your calendar will be holy. Does this make sense to everybody? And so there is no moment in your life where unholiness should be. That is what God is reminding Israel by regulating these things together. You could put this on top of that. It's not just what you do by yourself, it's what you do when you're together. God has a holy purpose to that. You cannot just get together and live together and celebrate God together any which way you want. There's holiness to that. But on top of that, this holiness has a purpose. And it's not just to show that every moment of your time must be holy. It's to show God's agenda with your time. God's agenda with your time. The yearly cycle is to show you the cycle of world history. Or shall we say, maybe cycle's not the right term, but the progression of world history. A yearly cycle, it has a beginning and it has an end. It's one complete unit. And in that way, God is showing his agenda for all of history through these celebrations. Does this make sense to everybody? And this is where things get layered and they get complex and complicated. And so, Passover, we already know that and understand that festival. It's how God provides redemption, yes? God provides redemption. He moves how Israel is even started. That's how everything moves forward. That's freedom from slavery unto a new kind of slavery. But the yearly cycle continues, and then you have the Feast of Weeks. It's also known as Pentecost. And Pentecost is a celebration that God provides the harvest. That God provides the harvest. It's really what we might call the first fruit of the harvest. Does this make sense? You guys know what a first fruit is? It's when you have an initial crop. And the initial crop is what you turn in and is indicative of a crop that is to come. Or put it this way, you guys do Costco samples? Yeah. Do you guys still sometimes go to Costco and just eat all the samples and you actually don't buy anything? College students used to do that all the time. Maybe you've gotten more of a conscience and so you don't do that. But maybe some of you do, and that's okay. Costco understands, I think. So all that to say is, a Costco sample is like first fruit. In Costco's mind, you eat that. That's an initial taste of what you're supposed to bring to. That is, you're going to buy the whole product. Does this make sense to everybody? And in the Feast of Weeks, the harvest is beginning. It is initiating. And so you bring to God the first of that with the hope and with the purpose that there is more what? To come. You are thanking him for that. Does this make sense to everybody? And then finally, there is the Feast of Booths. And the Feast of Booths marks the completion of the whole harvest, both early and late. The completion of the whole harvest, both early and late. And along that line, it ties it with this. The reason it's called the Feast of Booths is Israel was living in the wilderness, and they lived in what? Just guess. Booths. And so they're saying to God, thank you, just like you completed the harvest every year, we also know that in the past you brought us home, and you finished the process of the Exodus. It is God's faithfulness to complete both the yearly cycle as well as a cycle in the past, as in Israel's history. Y'all with me on this? And so, in fact, if you think about this, there's kind of multiple layers here. One layer is every year, relative cycle of harvest. You could say in the present time, we have Passover, which actually begins the harvest, and then the first fruit of that harvest, that's the weeks, and then the end of that harvest, that's the completion at the Feast of Booths. Does this make sense? Kind of beginning, almost beginning, and end. Y'all with me on this? That's the present. But this is indicative of something that happened in the past, which is Passover. God delivered what? Israel from who? Egypt. After 40 days, some people even suggest that that's when Mount Sinai took place. He showed, hey, this is who you guys are going to be. This is the promises that are to you. And then the Feast of Booths celebrates God allowing Israel to enter into the promised what? Land. Does this make sense to everybody? Now, if you had the past and you have the present, then maybe this also is indicative or a model of the what? Of the future. Passover. Who died on Passover? Lots of people did. I recognize it, especially a lot of lambs. But what individual am I thinking of? Jesus. He dies. Pentecost, the birth of the what? The church, which is known as the first fruit. Have you heard of that phraseology before? James 1 talks about how we are the first fruits of creation. Instance. Ephesians makes reference to that. And so, the church is the first fruit. We are the indication that there is more to what? To come. That's our job. We are the sample that shows that there is something better, there is something more to come, and we have the message that explains all that's going to happen. Does this make sense to everybody? And then the Feast of Booths, and you say, well, I don't remember anybody celebrating the Feast of Booths. Of course, because it hasn't happened yet. Hasn't happened yet. In the Old Testament, when God finally brings Israel home, really brings them home from the exile, they're going to celebrate the Feast of Booths. That's what it says. Why? Because just like God brought them home the first time around, He really brought them home what? The second time around. Does this start to make sense to everybody? And what did Peter want to build when the transfiguration happened? You guys remember that story? He wanted to build what? He wanted to build tents. Do you remember that? Jesus is transfigured into His full glory. Moses and Elijah show up. Y'all remember this? And Peter's like, hey, let's build some tents. And you have to wonder, why did the guy say tents? And you might say, well, because he wanted them to stay. If you really wanted them to stay, would you build them a tent? It's like, hey, Moses, you want a tent? I mean, I don't think so. I'd build them a what? Not a tent, but a house. You know, when a guest comes over to your home, do you say, hey, you want to stay in my tent? No. So, you would want them to have a house. So why does He start saying, let's build some tents? Because He says, hey, you guys are here. That means you're bringing Israel what? Back home. It's time to celebrate. We're done. History's over. We're in the kingdom. Does this make sense to everybody? And so Peter got a little bit excited, and he put his foot in his mouth, as he typically did. And God says, listen to my son. You know he has to die first, because he just said it in the previous chapter. So you need to know that that's going to happen. It's not the end yet. Does this make sense to everybody? Speak to me.
Well, the feast would be on the millennial kingdom.
Yes.
Right? Does the eternal state connect to that? Is it like all three together, or how does that work?
I would say, I think there's some overlap in that, but I think the celebration in the eternal state's different, because it's heightened, and it's just categorically different.
In connection to the feast, or not as much?
I think this is just a cycle, and it's going to shift in the eternal state. Yeah, but all that to say is that this right here, this holiness of our time, it has a purpose past, present, and future. Does that make sense? In the past, it shows what God did for Israel. In the present, it shows that same character God has is seen, is manifest in His yearly provision for His people. And relative to the future, it shows that this is exactly God's agenda for how He's going to accomplish the ultimate provision forever. Does this make sense to everybody? That is what is going on here. And if you understand this, then you understand really the rest of the story in a nutshell. All clear on this? So, God is holy. That determines our personal ethics. By the way, Leviticus 19, really important chapter. You should read it sometime. In fact, that's where you have, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. It comes from that chapter. And so this is a very formative chapter for us. It's connected with the New Testament. It's very seminal. Read it. God is holy with our time. He's holy as a corporate entity and demands that our corporate entity be holy, rather. And then on top of that, I wanted to hone in on Leviticus 26 in particular. Leviticus 26. As I said, this is about blessings and curses. You guys remember that, yeah? Blessings are for what? Obedience. Curses are for what? Disobedience. You need to know that paradigm. But you have to understand this. The way that Leviticus describes such blessing is significant. And the way he describes the curses is significant because there's a theology of holiness here. And it's not just holiness in the sense that, hey, if you obey, this is what happens, and if you don't, this is what happens, and so it's very strict. It's more than that. Look at the nature of God's blessings if you look at Leviticus 26, okay? Look at it with me. If you obey, God says, if you obey, notice what God will do. All right, notice what God will do. In Leviticus 26, God says that in verse 11, or no, okay, well, let's go to verse 12. Verse 12. That it's not just that God will dwell with them, but look at verse 12 specifically of chapter 26. Read it out loud, please.
I will also walk among you.
Stop. I will walk amongst you. If you understand this phrase, then you can tie everything we've been talking about all the nitty-gritty of holiness, which we must understand, to the big picture. And you need to do both. You need to know the nitty-gritty, and you need to know the big picture, and you need to know everything. That phrase, walk amongst you, is a very, very special verb in Hebrew. Very, very special verb. Let me give you some examples of this verb. Remember when God walked in the garden? Same verb. Remember Enoch? What did Enoch do? Walk with God. Same verb. And what is God's promise? If Israel, you really become holy, you will have that same relationship with who? With me. That is God. What is God saying? If you really have holiness, you can go back to where? Eden. You can go back to Eden. If you really have holiness, you can go back to Eden. Which totally makes sense because after all, on the seventh day, God what? He blessed the Sabbath and he what? He sanctified it. Yes? He made it holy. So you cannot have Eden without holiness. And if you really have holiness, you can go back to Eden. Does that make sense to everybody? Leviticus 26 verse 12 is so important. Keep reading the rest of the verse.
And be your God, and you shall be my people.
Everyone hear that? I will be your God, and you will be my people. Finally, you will have the fulfillment of the truest relationship with God. That's Exodus 19 verse 6. You'll have all of that. You'll have all of that. That's the power of holiness. Does that make sense to everybody? Holiness isn't just about God having a high standard and we need to live up to that. And of course, we know we can only do that by His grace. That's all true, and we can never diminish that. But holiness has a massive power in history because that's what brings you back to Eden. Does this make sense to everybody? All right. So in light of this, in Leviticus 26, we have this. But do you notice on the flip side, and here's the other thing to really know about Leviticus 26 and the blessings and curses, is that if you look at, say, verse 14 and following, if you don't obey and you don't do what God says, then this is what God's going to do. Do you see that in the text? Then do you see in verse 18, someone read it.
If also after these things you do not obey.
Stop. If after all these things you still do not what? Obey. What's the idea? These curses that God puts upon Israel, these punishments that He puts upon Israel, they're not just to punish them for the fun of it. They're not even just to satisfy His justice. What does God desire? That Israel would what? repent. They would turn. More punishment only comes when they refuse to what? Repent. These curses are actually meant to make Israel holy. Did you get that? These curses are actually to make Israel holy. By disciplining them, he will turn them around and bring them back to himself. And he only disciplines them further when they refuse to learn the lesson that these curses are to have, which are, you need to come back. You need to come back. Does this make sense to everybody? This is what is going on in Leviticus. Deuteronomy has a totally different purpose. Leviticus is about holiness. The positive side of holiness, which is you can go even back to Eden. The negative side of holiness, which is that one way or another, God will refine you to make you holy. Y'all with me on this? Does that make sense? And so this book, in every component, is helping you to understand the holiness of God. And if you do that, then you can understand, and you have the foundation to understand the book of Numbers, to which we turn to now. Open in your notes to Numbers. Numbers. Authorship and setting, I think we already know. Moses is equipping Israel with a worldview, with understanding who they are, what they need to do, how they play in God's plan, who their God is, things of this nature. And specifically at this point, Israel is still at Mount Sinai. Yes? They have learned about God's holiness, but they need, and here's the key, they need to get home. Because the Abrahamic covenant is about what? Land, seed, and what? Blessing. Well, they know that holiness is tied to the blessing. They are growing as a nation and are going to have an international impact. That's seed. But they need to be where? In the land. So they have to go back to the land. And Numbers is the journey of Israel going back to the land. Now, it's a little more complex than that. So you could say this. Fundamentally, it's about Israel returning home. But it's more than that. It's about God refining the nation along the way, or God displaying holiness along the way. That's what's actually going on. God displaying holiness, God refining the nation. And in relationship to the contents of the book, let me just overview this book for you really, really quickly to give you a feel for what is going on. Here's what you're going to see. God's going to say to Israel, hey, you guys need to march forward. And this march is going to be important, and I'll reiterate this in a second, because it is designed explicitly to teach Israel and to teach the world about God's agenda for holiness. So everything in the opening parts of the book are to elaborate that God has an agenda to display his holiness. It's not just a standard that's abstract that he has. It is rather an agenda he has. Everything will be made holy. Israel, you're marching the way you do to show that it's not only for you, it's for the world. What you do internally to yourself demonstrates this nature of this holy standard, and so you see that. Then the book starts to show how God will demonstrate this, which is, yes, you can demonstrate it positively, but you can also demonstrate it what? Negatively. And since Israel is not a holy people, guess which one he's going to use the most? Negative. And you're going to see judgment after judgment after judgment, so that Israel and the world understands this is holiness. This is holiness. And even if it takes executing an entire generation in the wilderness, God will do it to make a point. I'm holy. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, the nations at this point might be thinking, oh, well, that's nice. I'm glad that God's so holy. But you have to remember, Israel's marching to what? To war. Against who? The nations. And so the nations are starting to realize, wait a minute, their God's holy, and he's after us too. And that's what starts to happen toward the end of the book. The nations begin to learn God's agenda of holiness. And so what we have again is the first part of the book. God shows, hey, I have an agenda for holiness. This is part of my plan. Israel, the way you conduct yourselves, the way you're going to march, is going to show that between you and the world. They're all going to understand that. Then Israel marches, and God shows this negatively through his judgment. That's dramatic and powerful. And then the nations are going to learn this the hard way. And so Israel and the world will understand we have a holy God. And the reason that this book is so important, and this is so important in God's plan, is, like I said, oftentimes our understanding of history is just, we just need to turn evil to good. We just need to reinstitute blessing. But you can't have that without what? Holiness. And what Leviticus and what what Numbers does is it makes holiness a linchpin in God's plan. That's what it does. It makes it the issue. It's not just, hey, let's change society a little bit, or hey, let's make some improvements here and there on a horizontal level. You have to deal with holiness. That is the issue. And so relative to the audience of that day, letter B, you need to understand, and Israel would need to understand, God is a holy God. And you never violate his holiness. In fact, in subsequent generations, the way Numbers is often used, haven't you heard of how Psalms or even Isaiah and Hosea, they warn about what God did in the wilderness? I mean, we have that even in the New Testament with Paul, yes? And others, Jude, that talk about this is the application of the wilderness. God's holy. And if you try him, tempt him, oppose him, disobey him, you will be judged. Holiness is serious. And this time forms that conviction, a conviction that becomes paradigmatic for the rest of the Bible. Make sense? Letter B also, though, shows that God is still faithful. God is still faithful to keep his people. And that's going to shape a lot of things. Now, letter C. How about in generations beyond that? How about in generations beyond that? Well, there's a lot of things going on here. Holiness, still in the forefront. No one's denying that. But there's a lot of things happening with this whole wilderness thing because we understand relative to God's faithfulness that he needs to get Israel home. Yeah? He needs to get Israel home. He needs to establish them in the promised land. So he has to, even as he's judging them, his masterpiece is to still preserve them through that so that they end up in the promised land and operate the way they should. Y'all with me on this? And so that becomes very important for how God is going to characterize his plan. For instance, David was in the what? Wilderness. Why? Because he has to be refined just like Israel was what? Refined. After all, he has corporate what? Solidarity with them. See how that works? Speaking of Israel being in the wilderness, do you guys remember in Isaiah, I know it's not Old Testament Survey 2, but this passage should be familiar with you because it's not just in Isaiah, it's in Mark and Matthew and other books of the Bible. A voice crying out from the what? Wilderness. You see, when Israel gets kicked out of their land and they go into exile, it's as if they're going back into the what? The wilderness. God says, we're back in Numbers again. And you need to be refined. And I need to work on you. But I will bring you what? Home. Yeah.
So how Christ was in you, David, and everything. We're talking about people, or Israel and David going into the wilderness. Christ also went to the wilderness as well. Was he more so a type? I know he was representing Israel and David, but is it safe to say that he was being refined also?
He was being tested. Not necessarily. Refined might not have the wrong answers, the wrong implications. We don't want to say that he was imperfect or something like that.
That's why it's safe to
yeah, you would say he's being tested, which is true. He went through what? Tests. 3 of them. But unlike Israel and unlike David, who failed those tests, which causes their refinement, he doesn't. He's unrefinable because he's perfect. And the test just brings that out. Does that make sense? And this goes back to what I said earlier. Tests don't necessarily mean you're imperfect. For example, if I gave you an exam next week and you got 100%, you don't feel insulted that you took the exam. You're just happy that you passed the test, and the test proves what you already had. Yes? Testing Jesus in Matthew 4, that specific context, doesn't mean that he's imperfect or insinuate that he's imperfect. It just actually brings out that he always was perfect. See how that works? And that's where everything comes together in Matthew 4, really kind of building up to Matthew 4, because you need a king to bring you out. You need a king to bring you home. By the way, it wasn't just David in the wilderness. There's another dude who hung out in the wilderness, actually before Israel hung out in the wilderness. He hung out there for 40 years. His name starts with an M. Who is it? Say it out loud with confidence. Moses. The reason you have Israel in the wilderness is because Moses is in the wilderness. And the reason you have Moses in the wilderness is because Israel will be in the wilderness. And that's why David links back to Moses. See this? And so Jesus links back to David and Moses. And so God's point is, unlike any of these guys, this one doesn't fail. He'll bring you home. That's why a voice can really be crying out in the wilderness now, because this is the final moment, and he's going to be able to bring you home. And so on one hand, the Old Testament and the New Testament alike, and we need to learn that lesson very well, God is holy, and you don't mess with him. On the other hand, if you understand the theology of the wilderness, when that starts to reappear, you start to understand the grandeur of Jesus as the climax of all of that, as well as God's plan that he's going to bring everybody home. Does that make sense to everybody? And so this is a very powerful book in a lot of ways. It's very formative in a lot of ways. And we'll try to pick up on this as we see these ripple effects come out. Yeah?
I was just kind of reading through everything you're talking about. Some of the Egyptians came out with them, and maybe just how it interacts in this book, and like how, are they the ones that are doing all the sin, or is it Israel too? Or are they just intermingled? Or how does that relationship work?
Yep. That's it. We'll see it.
Okay.
The Bible makes it clear. Sometimes it's the rabble and they get everybody started and Israel picks up on that. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes.
How are they distinguished then?
It just says it in the text. It says like the rabble.
Okay.
And that's actually talking about the Egyptians.
Okay.
Yep. Or other pagans. All right. Next page. Any questions? All right, next page. The structure. Numbers revolves around two censuses. Censi. However you say that word in the plural, all right? There are two different times when a census is given, first generation and, if you like Star Trek, the next generation, or first generation and the second generation, all right? So, if that's what you need to trace. And it's going to be important because, as you know, one generation is really bad, yes? They're going to be eradicated. And by the way, here's the masterpiece of God's holiness. And just write this down because I might forget to mention it. That he raises up in the second generation, not the first one, but the second one. He raises in the second generation one of the best generations in the history of Israel. Now that's the masterpiece of holiness, yes? That you could refine people to the extent where they become some of the best in history. So, this book of Numbers is God's masterpiece in a lot of ways, showing off his holiness, showing how he refines people, showing that he can refine people, and it is victory accomplished, and leveraging all of that to advance his entire plan. It's just an amazing book of all that God is doing. All right? Oh, by the way, because of these censi or censuses or censi or whatever they're called, that's why this book is called Numbers, because there's a lot of numbers. All right, next page. Here we go. First generation. First generation. To boldly go. No, I'm just kidding. Main point. Main point. Here's the main point. As Israel was to travel, they must display God's holiness. As Israel is going to travel, or as Israel is traveling, another way to put it, they must display God's holiness. Now, just put a little note by this main point. Here's the thing. Two things. On one hand, God is going to announce. He's going to announce the nature of holiness in their travel. And the other way, he's going to demonstrate. So one is announcing it. One is demonstrating it. First part's about announcing it, just showing and setting up the infrastructure to show that this is the agenda. And then the second half is to demonstrate that, to exhibit that out. Right? And let's talk about that. So letter C, exposition. We there? So preparation to depart to the promised land. There is the first census in Numbers chapter 1. Now, what you need to know about this, and just jot some things down really quick, you need to compare Numbers 1 with Numbers 26. Just compare Numbers 1 with Numbers 26. We're not going to do that now. We're going to do it later. All right? And particularly, there are 3 tribes you want to compare. Right? 3 tribes. First tribe is Manasseh. Second tribe is Simeon. Third tribe is Judah. Manasseh, Simeon, Judah. And the reason that you want to focus on these 3 is one tribe will go up in number, and there will be a reason for that. Another tribe will go down in number, and there's a reason for that. And another tribe will stay totally dominant, and there's a reason for that. Guess which one is totally dominant? Excellent. Because that's the line of the what? Excellent. And so, look, Moses is no dummy. He hasn't forgotten that part of the equation. And so Judah is the dominant one. Notice letter B, the arrangement of the camps. Do you see how Judah is the first tribe on the east side? Yes? Do you see that? Why? Because they're the leading tribe. Okay? They're the leading tribe. Israel is moving really north and east from their location, and so Judah is leading the front. All right? Does this make sense to everybody? By the way, that would mean that the west and the south side, particularly the south side, are the least important. And guess who gets put on the south side? Look at the first one on the south side. Reuben. He's always the wannabe, right? Yeah, from Genesis. He's like, I want to be number 1. You're last. All right. This is actually going to come back in handy for later on. Uh-huh.
Are the tribes primarily named after sons of Jacob because he was named Israel?
No, they're just named after that because that's their ancestor. So it's kind of like a surname, but it's also your first name in this case. But it's because often you would be designated by sons of so-and-so. So son of Reuben, and then you become a Reubenite that way. So that's the logic of what's going on there. Now, the arrangement of the camp is very significant for several reasons. All right? For several reasons. First, what's in the center of the camp? Look at the diagram. Tabernacle. Who lives in the tabernacle? Okay, yes. Okay, that's true, humanly speaking. Levites. Who's dwelling in the tabernacle, though? God. And this is important. Because in ancient Near Eastern battle formations, you always put your king and most important person where? In the middle. And you're like, why? Well, we do this nowadays too, okay? Have you ever noticed the Secret Service, when they guard the president, they don't put him in front? Like, you walk out first. There could be a sniper there. You do it first, Mr. President. I mean, no one does that, right? I mean, you got to be crazy. This reminds me of a time when I was in Israel. And, well, this happened twice. I don't know how I always get involved in these things. But one time, it was with the Pope. And when the Pope comes to Israel, everything just shuts down. And you think the president has security? I mean, the Pope has security. He really does. This is very apropos on Reformation Day. Yeah, for the Vicar of Christ. I mean, he sure needs a lot of protection. So anyway, anyway, that being said, I kind of accidentally wandered into this secure area, and so it wasn't my fault. I was trying to lead a group, and they were behind, so I was like, oh, I should go on ahead. And then right after I walked past this line, they secured the area, so now I'm stuck. But it was cool because you could actually see the Pope's entourage travel, like on vehicles. We had these like Swiss Army guards in all black gear on motorcycles, big guns, and they're all driving one hand with a gun on the other is very impressive, and they're all there. And then you have like armored vehicles, and then you have several armored vehicles that the Pope could be in, right? It's a shell game. You all know what I mean by that. He could be in car 1, he could be in car 3, he could be in car 2. You don't know which one he's going to be in. And so they form this very protective layer of protection around this guy, all right? And they put him really dead center, or a relative center, all right? And this is all just imitating the logic that if you have your most important guy surrounded by all these guys, he's going to be protected, yes? And he's going to be highlighted as the most important one. So as Israel is walking, as they are marching, who do they put in the center? Not a human king, but who? God. Really the Ark of the Covenant. Does this start to make sense to everybody? Because they're proclaiming to the world, you need to understand who the true king is. You need to understand who is most important, and that is who? Our God. Our God. He is the true king. And so the arrangement of the camps is significant. Even more than that, the way that these camps are arranged and the very fact that you have a census, it is taking a census for a military purpose. It is taking a census for a military purpose. They're marching to war. And so what every nation now understands is Israel and what we're looking at them and how we're observing them, this is not just about them. It's going to be about who? Us. Because they're marching to what? Attack us. So their agenda directly has bearing on who? Us. Does this make sense to everybody? That is what is going on in the text. And so, in the next passages, when you start to talk about holiness, that inherently means it's not just for Israel, but what? The world. They are announcing that in their battle formations. You could put it this way, there is a sense that Israel will engage in a true holy war. And that's what they're announcing to the nations. By the way, if you're wondering, would the nations really understand all this? I mean, how would they ever find out? Nations have spies. City-states have spies. And they would send these spies to watch and monitor Israel, and then they would bring a report back. In fact, we know this. Do you guys remember Rahab? Remember that way later in Joshua's time? And Rahab hid Israel's spies. Israel's got some spies. And what did they say to them? We have heard the reports. Reports from who? From their spies. Of what your God has done. Of how he allowed you to come out of the wilderness and all this kind of, and Exodus and all this kind of stuff. They knew. They understood. Remember, actions speak louder than what? Words. And what we have now are a bunch of actions, and they're speaking louder than words. Yeah?
Okay, so how would they ever get enough information for Israel to not notice what they're doing and be like, what are you doing here? You're clearly a spy. What did you do?
Oh, well, they don't have to be inside the camp. They can be watching from the sidelines. They can be decently far away and monitoring Israel. And that's why, go to the next page, Israel has to do what they do. You see, you don't have to be a spy and infiltrate the ranks to see what Israel wants them to see. That's the key. And that's where we start to show some things. All right. So, letter C, spiritual preparation of the community. Let's see how this works. How do you, right, you maybe don't want an infiltrator spy in your midst and be like, I'm a spy. Can you tell me more about yourself? And then the guy dies. And then you actually fail your own mission because you're trying to explain this to the world. So they need to put on a show, a good kind of show, a holy show, you could put it that way, as they travel. Y'all with me on this? So let's see how they do it. Letter C, we there? Here's what we start to learn in the book of Numbers. Chapter 3 and following, Israel sets up an infrastructure that revolves around the tabernacle. Israel sets up an infrastructure. This is the first thing you have to do. Just jot it down in point number 3. Israel sets up a tabernacle infrastructure. And you say, wait, I already thought the tabernacle had a structure. Yes, but this is about taking it down, setting it up. This is like chapel media. This is tabernacle media. Chapel, tear down and set up. This is tabernacle, tear down and set up. Y'all with me on this? And the Levites have 3 major families. They have 3 major families. They have the family Kohath, they have the family Gershom, and they have the family Merari. Okay? Kohath, Gershon, and Merari. Everyone got that? Now, Kohath. The Kohathites are in charge, you could put it this way, of the innards of the tabernacle. That's like the ark and the altar, things of that nature. The table, the lamps. Does that make sense, everybody? Gershon is the skin. The skin of a tent would be what? Like the fabric. Yeah, the fabric of the tent. You know what I mean? And then Merari is the bones. Those would be all the tent poles. Does this make sense to everybody? And you need them all organized so that when you tear down the tabernacle and you set it up, it's a very what? Efficient, fast, quick, calm process. Does this make sense to everybody? And there's a reason why God goes to meticulous detail about this. Because if you're a spy looking far away and you just see chaos and you're treating the tabernacle like a piece of junk that you don't know how to set up, then that's how Israel thinks about their what? Their God, yes? But if you're looking through your binoculars, so to speak, or whatever, and all of a sudden you're seeing, whoa, look at them go. They've got this down. They're putting everything back together, and it's all about this one structure called the what? The tabernacle. Well, we know what's most important. Does this start to make sense to everybody? And they announce God is holy. He's not a God of chaos, he's a God of order, and God is central. Does this make sense to everybody? Tabernacle, tear down, and set up. Now, on top of this, you need to know one more thing. Which do you think had the best job out of those three guys? Like, who would you want to be? Okay, let's put it this way. Which do you think would be a greater privilege? Carrying the Ark of the Covenant, carrying a piece of cloth, or carrying a stick? Everyone's like, I'll take the stick. Why? Less responsibility. Fine. But that's not about privilege. The greatest privilege is what? The Ark. Does this make sense? You need to know this for later. You need to know this for later. You could put it this way. It always stinks to be in second place, doesn't it? And who's really in second place? The Kohath people. Because they're not priests. They're what? They're priest helpers. These are all Levites, which maybe you need to know this. You guys know rectangle, square, square, rectangle kind of thing? Like all squares are rectangle, but not all rectangles are squares. Remember that logic in math? Well, all priests are what? Levites, but not all Levites are what? Priests. Does this start to make sense to everybody? And so what you have to understand is that, hey, these guys, Kohath, Gershon, Merari, not all of them are priests. None of them are priests. And so they don't have that kind of special responsibility. Nevertheless, out of all these guys, the Kohathites are the best, the most privileged. Make sense to everybody? It's going to be important for later. In any case, Israel, through their tabernacle, tear down, and set up, are showing God's holiness. Here's another thing that you need to understand. Second, it's in how they address purity. It's in how they address purity. For example, in Numbers chapter 5, God says this, unclean people out of camp. Some people think that if you were unclean at that moment, Israel just left you behind. That could be an interpretation. But more likely, it shows this, that unclean people, if you touched something unclean, ate something unclean, touched someone that was unclean, you had to what? You had to get out of the camp. So, if this is the tabernacle, and you have people here, 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 and here, yes? What would you daily be seeing if you were a spy zooming out? You'd be seeing people what? Leave the camp, come back in the camp. You'd see people what? Leave the camp, come back what? In the camp. You see people leave the camp, come back what? In the camp. Does this make sense? You would see huge amounts of people just filtering in and out of the camp, getting kicked out of the camp. And what do you learn from that? God is what? Holy. That when you're unclean, you really can't get near God. And that God really does care. How do we know that he cares? Because you see all these people having to what? Leave. They have to get out. And so the march of Israel visibly would demonstrate that God's holiness is not an empty idea. It's serious. You can see it. It's tangible. Similarly, you could also see it this way. At this moment in chapter 5, we have the law of the adulteress, or the accused adulteress. Do you guys remember that law? A woman accused of adultery, she would sit and they would make her drink like this dust. Do you guys remember this? And it would say that her thigh would wither away if she was lying. Do you guys remember that? And isn't that, on one hand, it's a little bit puzzling, and on the other hand, you might not know why it's there. So let's answer both questions. First, why is it there? You guys should know by now, via the context, this is all about what? Holiness. And it's showing that marriage and purity, it's a big deal. It's a huge deal. Isn't it interesting that marriage has always been threatened? Have you ever noticed that? It's like we think the battle about marriage is new to our culture or our time. And maybe in some ways it is. But on the other hand, there's been continuity from the very beginning. It's always been under attack. Because that's one of the easiest ways to attack God's holiness. He set up a certain thing, a certain way. And if you violate that, you're impure. And so, what Israel does is it upholds the purity of marriage in a very visible and dramatic way, which gets into the second part. So, part of the drama is so that everyone knows, from Israelite to people outside of the camp to even the world, our God's a holy God. And the institution of marriage should be taken seriously because he's pure. And you cannot contaminate it. Does this make sense to everybody? But you might wonder, what's this whole deal with the dust and all this kind of stuff? Some people view it as magical. They're usually not Christians who view it this way because obviously people in Moses' day should not practice what? Magic. So that would be bad. Second option is some people think it's psychological. Like, hey, lady, drink this powder. Doesn't it taste so bad? Confess. So it's kind of like interrogation tactics or something. Okay, maybe. Third, it could just actually be trying to simulate what happens. In other words, the terrible feeling that she will have and the fact that her eye will wear away and all this kind of stuff, that might actually be the case in Israel. Because after all, if you obey, you will be what? Blessed. And if you disobey, you will be what? Cursed. And God might punish someone based on this in Israel. Under that system of the law, God might punish an adulteress by causing her to be barren. And that is what this is pointing out. And so it's not magical, and it's not psychological, it's theological. It's theological. They make her drink this, not to try to trick her into a confession, but to tell her, God will do something just like this to you. So you better tell the truth. And all of that demonstrates how God is holy. Make sense to everybody? We good on this? Here's the final thing. All right, here's the final thing. So you have tabernacle teardown, shows God's holiness. The demand of purity shows the height of his holiness. And here's the third thing under that. And this is this, blessing. Blessing and consecration. Have you guys ever heard of the Nazirite vow? The Nazirite vow. Have you heard of that? You can't eat, or anyone remember, what's the most famous part of it? You can't cut your hair, but you can't eat anything of the grape, and you can't touch anything that's dead. Does this make sense to everybody? You need to know those regulations for later. For example, like Samson, remember him? He doesn't cut his what? Hair, but remember he touches a dead animal, doesn't he? So he breaks his Nazirite vow every day. Okay? Drinks wine. Well, that would be the fruit of the what? the grape, so that would be bad. So just pay attention to these things. The Nazirite vow. Speaking of which, you do need to know some things about the Nazirite vow. Not only no alcohol or grapes, no razor, no contact with the unclean, but on top of that, you need to know two things with this. Two major lifelong Nazirites. Or three. Let's do that. Three. Anyone know? I already gave one. Samson. Who else? Starts with an S. Samuel. Another one. John the Baptist. John the Baptist. Okay? Three guys. All right? Lifelong Nazirites. And we'll round out the conversation to this in a second. You need to know the purpose of a Nazirite. The purpose of a Nazirite is total dedication to God. Dedication to God. And they would be very visible if for no other reason they didn't cut their what? Their hair. Yes? And why is this important? Because Israel and the world needs to understand God's holiness really does require what? Absolute dedication. Right? Visible dedication. A dedication that makes a difference. It changes your life. And so these Nazirites were meant to show that level of set-apartness and consecration. It was meant to demonstrate that. They had a special purpose. Make sense to everybody? And if you understand this, and you understand what it's doing as they're wandering in the wilderness, then you understand particularly these two guys. They were lifelong Nazirites. Why? Who did Samuel introduce? Big main character, starts with a D. Who did John the Baptist introduce? Jesus. You think that's a coincidence? You think that, oh, well, looky there. Wow, God. I can't believe, you did the same thing twice. I mean, no, what is this? This is intentional. The Kingmaker will be a lifelong Nazirite. Why? Because he will be set apart to God for that purpose. Does this make sense to everybody? By the way, to introduce him, you meet Samuel and his evil twin, Samson. Okay? This is a guy dedicated to God in all the wrong ways. This is a guy dedicated in all the right ways. The right guy becomes the parallel to John the Baptist. Does this make sense to everybody? And so that's what's going on there. More on that later, but you just need to know now that God institutes an entire office to show the nature of dedication. To show the nature of dedication. Because he's a holy God, and that's the message he's announcing to the world. Along that line, you have the Aaronic blessing. The Aaronic blessing. Numbers 6. Turn there with me. Numbers 6. Look at verse 24 and following. Someone read it, please, out loud.
The Lord bless you and keep you.
Stop. Bless you and keep you. What does this show you? Holiness ultimately leads to what? Holiness ultimately leads to blessing, which shouldn't surprise us. Isn't that what we saw with the Sabbath? Yes? Keep going.
The Lord make his face shine on you.
Okay, make his face shine on you. It shows that holiness leads to the fullness of relationship between God and man. Keep going.
And be gracious with you.
Yep. Here we have, it leads to the fullness benefits. And on top of that, he will give you what? What's the last phrase of verse 26? He will give you
Peace.
and give you peace. That's the state of rest and wholeness that we're talking about. Yes? And so as Israel is going to journey, they're announcing to the world, hey, this is not just about us, this is about you. And this is the nature of holiness. That everything is about God. We have the highest level of purity that demands total dedication, and that does lead to rest and peace. If you really have this, holiness matters. Holiness matters. And this is the nature of that holiness that does matter. Make sense to everybody? So that's what God desires to announce through Israel. And you might put it this way. This is a very high standard. Will Israel keep it? You guys already know the answer to that. The answer is what? No. So they're going to get ready to depart, letter D. You have these trumpets that are going to announce departure. Why do you need a trumpet to do so? Because you're dealing with lots and lots and lots of people. By the way, some people would estimate, based on the census data, that Israel could have millions, between 3 to 6 million people in the wilderness at this time. So that's a lot of people. So you need something loud to signal people to move. Otherwise, people start to move and it'll be just chaos. And you don't want chaos, because who's in control? God, and you want to show that he's holy. So they depart, letter E. Next page. And here we go. Chapter 11. You have people who start to complain. Chapter 11. You have people who start to complain, and guess what happens? What does God do? Look at look at chapter 11, verse 2. What does he do?
People therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out.
Okay. God sends fire, kills them. That's what happens. They're burned, who are complained. Notice in verse 4, at the moment that this happens, you can start to look at the rabble. See that in verse 4 of chapter 11? This is where you start to see even the pagans are starting to influence Israel all the wrong ways. It's actually a reversal of everything. Israel's supposed to influence the nations, but now the nations are influencing who? Israel. It's totally backwards. And they start complaining about food. And guess who also complains with Israel? Look at verse 10 of chapter 11, quickly.
Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was kindled, and Moses was displeased.
Keep going.
So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you been so hard on your servant?"
Stop. Who else complains? Moses. Which is one reason, and it's going to be a contributing factor to the fact that he cannot even enter what? The promised land. He's part of the problem, not the what? Not the solution. Okay? Everyone's starting to complain. There's a problem with food. There's a problem with the leadership. So you have to solve both. And this is going to be very important. The way that God's going to do this is he's going to send some quail. It's actually pretty phenomenal. These quail, they kind of hover at like 2 feet off the ground, and you can just whack them and kill them. It's pretty amazing. But on top of that, here's what also happens in chapter 11. Here's what also happens in chapter 11. The Spirit, the Holy Spirit, comes down to empower certain leaders. The Holy Spirit comes down to empower certain leaders. You need to know that. You need to know that. Let me say that again. The Holy Spirit comes to empower certain leaders. And here is what Moses says. And you need to know verse 29 of chapter 11. As Israel's beginning to journey, and really their journey's only begun, Moses says this. Someone read 11:29.
But Moses to him, "Are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit on them."
Okay, what does Moses say? What does he wish? I wish God would put his Spirit on who? Everyone. Moses knows the only way you're really going to become holy and you're going to be able to live with God and you're going to be able to fulfill all these things is if you have who? If you have who? The Holy Spirit. He knows the solution to the problem from the very beginning. Everyone got that? He knows the solution to the problem from the very beginning. You cannot resolve any of this apart from the work of the Holy Spirit. Everyone understand that? He knew the doctrine in a sense of regeneration in its infancy, I guess you could put it that way, from the very, very get-go. And so as Israel's starting and God is starting to refine them, they start to complain about food, they start to complain about leadership. Moses says, the only way we're going to get out of this, the only way we're going to survive is if you want holiness, you need the Holy Spirit. Everyone got that? Good. Next page. Or not next page, next thing. Dealing with the insubordinate, chapter 12. Look, it's not just that the people have problems. It's that even the leadership themselves have problems, like Moses, but not only Moses. Who rebels in chapter 12? What person? For 12:1. Look at it. Miriam. Yes? Miriam rebels. So you have the lay people rebelling, the leadership rebelling. Point C. And you have this rebellion on the highest level. you have this rebellion on the highest level, letter C. We there? You guys know the story. It's send 12 spies into the land, and they bring back a report, and you know it's a good land, but it's also a terrifying land, yes? And people fail to believe. In fact, what's interesting about Numbers 13 and 14 is that the Bible comments on Israel's lack of faith. It's very important, the wording there. The Bible comments that Israel did not believe. Why is that important? What did we say from the very beginning? Israel was always a nation built on what? Faith. Who had faith originally? I mean, what human person? Abraham, because he believed who? God. Israel has stopped walking in the footsteps of their father Abraham. That's why this sin in Numbers 13 through 15 is so atrocious. Y'all with me on this? Now, you need to know, and I'm just going to mention a couple things here. First, you need to understand this. Israel says, we don't want to go in the land and we're not going. So does God give them what they want? When he says you won't go in the promised land. Did they want that? Yeah, they said, I want to go, so God says, I'll just do what you said. Is it fair? Yeah, he gave them not just what they deserved, but actually even what they wanted. And here's the second thing you need to realize from this text. In Numbers 14, verse 3, the parents say this, oh, we don't want to go in the land because we're afraid that our children will be threatened by these bad guys. See the irony? What does God say in the end? It will be actually your children that what? Conquer the promised land. Do you see that? Because it's the second generation. Does it start to make sense? That's why God does what he does. It is to show that their unbelief was totally invalid at every single point. Does this make sense to everybody? But this is the highest form of rejection. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I conclude at this point that God was establishing the truth that salvation is by faith, individually, not inherited from, because like I'm seeing Abraham had faith.
Yes.
And I see also Moses here that these people, they don't have the Holy Spirit and they need the Holy Spirit. And they start rebelling, showing that they never had even faith in God. So can I conclude that since we see that among them, few of them had faith and it was in God, but many of them, they never had faith. But God was fulfilling the promise of taking them to the promised land, but not dictating that they have salvation. So that's why they're rebelling.
Yes.
Was it establishing that?
Yes. It's not all the way, but we have the building blocks of it, like your faith of your parents isn't your faith. Right? You can't just do that. Just because you say Abraham believed, that doesn't mean I believe. So these are very important things on that individual level that God is establishing as we're moving forward. Good. So Moses steps in as a mediator, which shouldn't surprise us because didn't he have to step in as a mediator before? And so that's exactly what he does here. And so God says, this whole generation will die. And here's what you need to understand. This is the highest offense because they do not believe. Even though that is the bedrock of their nation is to believe, they do not do what they're supposed to do. So that is the highest offense. You have the breadth, lay people, leaders, they all do not believe. And so God says, I will execute all of them. And you need to understand, that sends a message. If God is willing to kill an entire nation just to prove he's holy, that should show you how holy he is. Yeah? That should show you how holy he is. And that's what happens here. Next page. Next page. Now, here's what's interesting. Oh, I should put this one thing down so I'm not so sounding. And God's not that negative sounding. Here's what's really interesting. Look at chapter 15 and just jot this down. Even on the next page, it's fine. Chapter 15, God says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, notice the next phrase in verse 2, listen to it very carefully, when you will come to the land. Why is that very important wording? Think about Dr. Varner's statement. It's not if you go to Ibex, or it's not, if you go to Ibex, it's what? When. Why? Because there's no if about it. You're just going. It's just a matter of what? When. What does God say here? You will say to them, when you enter the promised land. Why? don't worry, Israel. Even though you sin so terribly, and you guys are so bad, and you don't believe, which is the height of rebellion against God, God will still ensure, because he's faithful, it's not if, but what? But when. Make sense to everybody? God continues to refine the nation. He deals with the irreverent. This person does not keep the Sabbath. Letter E, he deals with the rebellious. He deals with the rebellious. Do you guys remember how Kohath was like number 2? Remember that? He was almost there. Well, guess what? Kohath and a guy from Reuben, Dathan and Abiram, they rebel against Aaron. They rebel against Aaron. Guess why Reuben rebels? Because he's always like, I want to be number 1. And you're like, dude, every time you do that, it just gets bad. And this time it's going to be really bad. Like the earth is going to swallow you. Okay, but Kohath does it because he's almost there. Yeah, I carry the ark. Why can't I be a priest? But you have to remember, the system that God sets up, the way you become holy must be what? Holy. Yes? And so their rebellion against this system isn't just a political maneuver. It's a rebellion against who? God. And the way he has established everything. Does this make sense to everybody? And that is what's happening at this juncture. God is being rebelled against, and therefore the earth will swallow them up. In fact, the people with them, they're offering incense on 250 censers. They're burned up because if you do not offer the right sacrifice, you become what? The sacrifice. That's exactly what's going on here. And so God deals with the rebellious. Letter F. God deals on, by the way, after God in letter E deals with the rebellious, you know what the people do, just to show you their heart? They start to want to kill Moses. It's like, dude, the reason you guys are dying is because you're rebelling against Moses and God. So they just say, well, let's kill Moses some more. Well, it doesn't make any sense. And for this, God decides to kill more Israelites. And in another plague, get this, one day, 14,700 people die. 14,700 people die. When you see that, you understand God is holy. Yes? Letter F, dealing with failed leadership. It's not just the breadth of destruction that's going on, it's the depth as well. Miriam's dead. She dies in the wilderness. Why? Because she's part of the rebellious what? Generation. But remember Moses? He, instead of talking to the rock, he what? He struck it. And so God says, you're out too. And you might say, man, that just doesn't sound very fair. It is fair because God is what? Holy. That's fair. One infraction. That's fair. And so we start to see that's the breadth of God's holiness. Now, things start to change. Letter G, deliverance from Arad. What we start to see is that God's holiness isn't just for Israel, it's for the nations. It's for the nations. Israel begins to wage war against certain nations, and it begins to show he really does have holiness isn't just about keeping Israel holy, it's about all the nations being holy. Letter H, here's what becomes interesting. And it's dealing with the impatient. On one hand, you have some guys, they're not good, they complain, the snakes come, they don't look at the snake, they die. But do you have other people who actually what? Look at the and live. Y'all with me on that? Now that phrase, that they look at the snake and live, that last part, and live, is used to describe people like Caleb and Joshua. Remember them? Those were the good spies. Remember those guys? Why is this important? Because the faith that Caleb and Joshua had, that they had, becomes the faith of a new what? New generation that survived the plague of snakes. Y'all with me on this? God is changing his people. He is refining to make them what they should be. By the way, the wording is found in Numbers 14:38, and it is found in Numbers 21, verses 4 through 9 as well. All right? That's where you're looking at. All right, next page. Yeah, huh?
After Moses striking the rock, then God told him that he won't go to the promised land. So immediately from verse 14, I saw Moses' response. He never even consulted God. To me, I was like, then after Moses says that he won't go to the promised land, so he found a shortest distance to reach to the promised land. That's why he consulted the king of Edom to pass through that without consulting God. I don't know whether Moses wanted to force himself to go to the land by finding the shortest distance.
Oh, okay, I see what your question is. No, this was the normal route. This is the main route that they would take. So it's not Moses trying to force the issue. He knows that he's not going to go there. Rather, what you start to see in this transition is that Israel, for the first time, is starting to interact with nations like Edom, like Moab, and through that, they're trying to show God's holiness to them. Arad is the kind of the climax of that. All right? Yeah, that's what's going on. Okay, here's what we need to see. Letter I, we there? And I'll say this, and then maybe we can conclude some things. I and J. So, along that line of Israel walking through Edom, along that line of Israel walking through Moab, or Arad that we just saw, Israel is starting to project holiness to all of these nations. Israel is starting to project holiness to all of these nations. And as they start to conquer nations like Sihon, you need to know these two names, Sihon and Og, Israel starts to conquer them. They are showing in Numbers, and God is showing, that holiness isn't just for Israel. Holiness is for who? The whole world. God will not judge merely Israel for their unholiness. God will judge even the world for its what? Unholiness. Does this start to make sense to everybody? And so God is advancing his plan forward, and we have seen that on a very physical level, because this is dealing with a physical attack. Does this make sense to everybody? And then next time, what we'll try to see as we wrap up Numbers is on letter K is what happens though if you don't have a physical attack, but you have a what? Just guess. A spiritual attack. And that's what Balaam tries to do, and it provides an opportunity to really highlight God's agenda, his total agenda for all the world through Israel, and that's where Balaam's oracles become very, very important. Have a good day.